Hunter, have you ever visited a national park of
Have
the
I ever?
United States, or anywhere, to be honest? And what'd you
Okay.
think of it?
I have visited national parks in the United States and some national parks in a few other countries. The one that comes to mind immediately for me is Arches National Park in Utah.
Interesting. That I would not have guessed that. I mean, it's a little far away from us. If I had to have guessed, I thought you were going to say like Mount Rainier or Crater Lake,
I've been
because
to,
the proximity.
right. I've been to both those places as well, and they're both fantastic. I mean,
Mhm.
Mount Rainier is beautiful. The Olympic National Park is fantastic. Crater Lake is very dramatic. The Grand Canyon is very dramatic.
Yeah.
But Arches, it was a kind of environment, a kind of landscape that I was very unfamiliar with. I've not spent tons of time in desert type places. And, the arches and the bouncing rocks and all these sort of very distinctive landforms were fascinating to me. I felt like I was in a Roadrunner video or something like that. This is like, from living in the Northeast, that's my exposure initially to that kind of landscape, was those cartoons. And then to sort of
Right.
go there and to see how varied Utah is, because there's these, the Wasatch are not a national park, but beautiful forests. So yeah, I'm going to go with Arches, but I've been to a bunch that I think are fantastic.
Yeah. I mean, I think one, you nailed on, or you're at least hinting at something that we're going to talk a little bit about, which is the dramatic landscape and scenery sort of in the western half of the United
Yes.
States compared to the eastern half. And that's not to say that there's not beautiful, majestic areas of the eastern half of the country. However, we're going to show that, perhaps there's reasons why. Well, we'll get to it.
Yeah,
All that's to say is there's a lot of national
value
parks on this
placed on
side.
those kinds of landscapes, and so I guess we'll get to that.
We're going to get to that. Yeah. And so I guess just to add my experience, I've also been to Crater Lake, very beautiful. I've been to Olympic National Park, very beautiful. I've also been to the Utah, they're called the Mighty Five,
Mhm.
the Utah National Parks, which is, Capitol Reef, Bryce Canyon, Zion, Arches, and was it Colorado Plateau, maybe?
Canyonlands?
The fifth one.
Is it?
Canyonlands.
Yeah.
There you go. Canyonlands. It's in the Colorado Plateau.
Right.
Canyonlands. And all of them are so spectacular for so many very different reasons. Zion is the one that to me was just like, you sort of get to it and you're sort of at this small little town at the entryway, and you sort of wander in, and all of a sudden you're in this majestic, like green area surrounded by these like red cliffs that sort of, line both sides. And it's so awe-inspiring. You're like, how is this a thing?
Yeah. How does this exist? I mean, that was kind of a Grand Canyon moment too, where I've heard about this so much and it couldn't possibly deliver, on all the hype. And then you get there, and I went to the north and the south rim, and I was like, wow, this is fantastic. I can't believe I get to be here.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, listener, if you haven't guessed, today we're going to talk all about the national park system. Specifically, we're going to talk about national parks in the United States. There are national parks elsewhere in the world. Of course, the United States doesn't have a monopoly on them. But we're focusing on the U.S. national parks for a number of reasons. For one, we're based here in the United States. We're based here in Oregon. And if you couldn't tell, we already have plenty of experience with our local national parks. Seems like Hunter might have some international experience, but I think it's just easier to sort of, talk to that experience a little bit since we're from here. But also because the U.S. national park system is controlled by a federal agency called the National Park Service, which just gives us an overwhelming, abundant wealth of data that allows us to really pull out some fun geographic facts and figures that really, to be honest, it creates a really compelling podcast series. So we're gonna talk all about the U.S. national parks. We'll hint at some stuff going on elsewhere in the world a little bit, especially in the history. But overall, this is going to be about the U.S. national park system. Really quick, Hunter, I had this question in my notes for you. You kind of already answered it, but we're based here in Portland. Do you know what the closest national park to us is?
It's Mount Rainier.
It is absolutely Mount Rainier.
Yeah.
I think the reason why I ask, because I think most people, if they're familiar with Oregon, knowing that we're here in Oregon, they would have said, maybe Crater Lake. But Crater Lake is actually pretty far south. It's
pretty far south. Yeah.
It's almost to the border of California. Maybe like another hour's drive or so.
I mean, the
Olympic
National Park is probably closer than Crater Lake as well. Yeah.
Absolutely. We're also going to talk about national parks because they have also become kind of very emblematic of the United States itself, attracting millions of visitors, both domestically, but also internationally. In fact, we're going to get to some of those statistics later, but
Great.
the the national park system of the United States is frequently cited in sort of traveler surveys as the reason why people come to the United States. They want to go visit places like New York, Miami, LA, these, really fun metropolitan areas, but they also really want to see the natural areas because they are quite stark and very different, especially compared to places that don't have as dramatic of scenery.
Mhm.
And so that's another. This is a reason why we're also going to talk about national parks today. And what we're also going to find is that the U.S. National Park Service and the national parks themselves have just great branding. They have really pulled out all
Yeah.
the stops and the marketing and just created a system that, well, people just love them. And there's so much. We're not going to talk so much about the marketing and effort and the commercialization of it, but there's a whole business sort of surrounding these parks where people like to wear shirts sort of representing iconic sort of images of these parks or collect maps of them. There's a whole business surrounding these things. It's really great branding that the National Park Service has
Yeah, I
done.
can
Sort of like
imagine. I
NASA.
can. What's that?
Sort of like NASA. Like NASA
Right.
has really great branding
Right.
too.
They've done pretty well. Yeah, with the National Park Service, I can imagine some of these sort of stylized posters that go along with each of the national parks. And there's this particular aesthetic. It's sort of simple but elegant. And it's interesting how, they distill these huge areas into one image that actually is pretty powerfully representing it.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And it's kind of amazing because these are federal agencies. Well, National Park Services. So is NASA, sort of the corollary for the good branding. These are federal agencies that we typically think of as like being mired in bureaucracy and
Right.
stodginess and sort of like government and like all these kinds of things that's just not necessarily sexy, for lack of a better word. And yet, despite all of that, the National Park Service is just like home run, right?
Yeah,
With the
absolutely.
marketing.
Yep.
So, let's go ahead and dive into the episode. Hunter, first question for you as we kick this off. What, in your opinion, is a national park? Or do you have any guess at what a national park actually is?
I have a guess. I don't know for sure. I believe a national park is an area that's designated as such. There's a boundary around it. And this allows the US government to control what happens in the area. And the idea is to preserve it from certain kinds of development, like logging and urban development in most cases. And it's largely reserved for natural reasons and for people to visit and appreciate. That's my guess.
That's a great guess. That's almost exactly. And we're going to find. We're going to talk a little bit about this, but there's different, slightly different definitions depending on sort of where the national park is being founded, right? So, at its most basic, and you sort of already covered this, at its most basic, a national park is an area set aside by a national government for the preservation of the natural environment.
Mhm.
Now, what that preservation for, that's sort of the key differentiator. So within the United States and Canada, they tend to focus on the protection of both land and wildlife.
Mhm.
So things, prohibiting things like drilling and mining and deforesting, that kind of stuff. Those in the United Kingdom, however, tend to focus mainly on access to the land. So there might not be so many stipulations against, mining or deforesting. And in fact, if you go to the Scottish Highlands, there's some national parks up there. There's developments within those things, extensive developments and even farms. However, people are allowed to have access to them. That's sort of the key point. It's, make sure that people have access to this. Those within various countries in Africa are a little bit different as they primarily exist to conserve wildlife and animals. So you're thinking about sort of a national park that's sort of designed to create habitat for elephants so that they can, breed and prosper and all that kind of stuff. And so on and so forth, right? We're not going to go through every single country, but those are just some examples. Specifically, according to the U.S. National Park Service's criteria for national parks, a potential park should meet all of the following standards. 1, it is an outstanding example of a particular type of resource. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean like an extractable resource. Just there's something there, right? There's something that's maybe it's a wealth of forests, a big mountain, something like that.
It's an interesting term to
Two,
use, the resource, in this context.
I know, right?
Yeah,
it's very, I would say, laid into sort of the capitalist sort of mindset. That's sort of the federal government. Yeah, it's very.
You can tell the feds are involved. Yeah.
Two, it possesses exceptional value or quality in illustrating or interpreting the natural or cultural themes of the nation's heritage. And so I think that's probably pretty self-explanatory. Three, it offers superlative opportunities for recreation, for public use and enjoyment, or for scientific study. And so this is, again, one of the ways that it might differ a little bit from the UK, because a national park in the US does not have to be for recreation. Typically, we think of that, right? We think of places like the Grand Canyon and doing hikes around the Grand Canyon, that kind of stuff. But that does not actually have to be the criteria if there's a big enough criteria that it's worthy of scientific study.
Okay. Interesting.
And then 4, it retains a high degree of integrity as a true, accurate, and relatively unspoiled example of the resource that we talked about in the first one. So a mountain, a forest that hasn't really been spoiled yet, if it's already been logged, to the point where there's no more trees, then obviously it could have been very beautiful 100 years ago, but it's not going to be a national park today because it's already been spoiled.
Right.
So it has to be sort of relatively pristine and maintained.
Also an interesting term, the spoiling, because if it's spoiled by, spoiled suggests that it's humans that have had an impact on it. If there's a fire that's a natural fire, I don't know if that qualifies as being spoiled or not, but again, the terminology here is worth paying attention to.
Well, and what we're going to find out is that while this criteria exists, it's also kind of meaningless.
I see.
There's some reasons for that, or not, I wouldn't say they're good reasons, but we'll get to that in a little bit because there's one specific park we're going to talk quite a bit about later in the episode.
Okay,
but that's for later. Little teaser there. Now, I think there's a potential park should meet all of the 4 criteria standards. This is a key word because of the reasons I just said, right? This is that, that's the wiggle room right there. These should have all of these, but they don't necessarily all do.
Okay.
Finally, it's worth pointing out that within the National Park Service is the federal agency under the Department of the Interior that sort of manages all the parks. Under the National Park Service, the agency runs and manages all of the national parks and other designations as well. And I'm sure you've heard of some of these. Hunter, do you know what some of these other designations might be?
I'm thinking National Monument is one of the ones that comes to mind.
That's the other big one.
Okay.
Absolutely. National Monument is the other big one. So we think of the National Park Service, we think of places like Yosemite, Yellowstone, all these national parks, but these would be national parks themselves. There's national monuments, which is the other sort of big one that most people don't think about, as readily. However, people have probably heard of them. The key difference here is that national monuments can be established by the President of the United States, but a national park requires congressional approval.
Interesting.
So this is, the President Biden wants a place, in, let's say, Oregon to be a national monument. He just sort of signs an executive order and it becomes a national monument. Conversely, this means that a president can also sign an executive order and the national monument designation goes away.
Okay.
As opposed to a national park, which would require congressional approval going both ways,
okay.
Right?
So there's probably more national monuments than national parks, I'm guessing.
There are,
okay.
Yes. These can also be human-made structures in addition to natural. So an example of a natural national monument would be Devil's Tower in Wyoming. So if you're unfamiliar with it, it's a very cool sort of spire that juts out of the earth, hundreds of feet into the air. Very cool.
Okay.
But it's kind of small too. A human-made structure that's a national monument would be the Statue of Liberty, right? So those are your two sort of corollaries for
I've been to the Statue of Liberty. Yes.
Yeah, right. Moving on, there's national lake shores or seashores, and these are coastal areas that have been federally designated by Congress as being of natural and recreational significance as a preserved area along a coast of a major water body. There are, of course, some national parks that have a coastline, but there's a few sort of national lake shores or seashores. if you can't tell, Hunter, as we get through some of these lesser known designations, they become sort of more unknown. And I would say most people are like, I don't know of a single national lakeshore or seashore,
Yeah, I'm
but you
less
probably
familiar.
do know
Yeah.
of one. Yeah. In fact, the example I have here of a national seashore is Cape Cod in Massachusetts.
Oh, yes, of course. I didn't
Right.
realize that was designated as such, but growing up where I did, I've been to Cape Cod. Yeah.
I've definitely heard of Cape Cod. I absolutely did not know that it was a national seashore or lakeshore.
Yeah. No,
So,
it's even news to me. I feel like I should know that, but now I do. So thank you.
yeah. Moving on, there's national memorials. This is a designation of the United States for an officially recognized area that memorializes a historic person or event. And so the most famous one of these would be the Washington Monument in Washington, D.C. A number of forts are also national memorials, or various houses where famous people, famously historic people lived or were born, that kind of stuff. There are national preserves. So these were established by an act of Congress to protect areas that have resources often associated with national parks, but where certain natural resource extractive activities, such as hunting and mining, may be permitted.
Oh, okay.
And so this is sort of right. You can't do that in a national park, but in a national preserve, you can. There's just more regulations around it. It's like, hey, we want to enable this kind of economic activity here. We don't want it to be strip mined. We don't want everything to be pulled out. However, we want that to still be able to exist. We don't want it to be a national park.
So there's extra rules compared to land that doesn't have that designation.
There are extra rules, but it's still allowed. Yes. Okay. It's worth pointing out that typically a national preserve is connected to a national park. So up in Alaska, Denali National Park, there's also Denali National Preserve. They're just connected. Denali National Park is a little bit smaller and you can't do anything in there, but obviously in the preserve surrounding it, you can.
Okay.
The Mojave Desert is also a national preserve.
Interesting.
There are, of course, national rivers designated to preserve certain rivers with outstanding natural, cultural, and recreational values in a free-flowing condition for the enjoyment of present and future generations. I believe, I couldn't find this out specifically, I believe this means that areas with the designated area cannot be dammed, at least by humans. And so, listener, we have a whole episode all about dams. You can go check out.
Check it out.
That's our little callback. There are national parkways, and these are scenic roadways with a protected corridor of surrounding parkland. So these are typically roadways that will oftentimes go through a national park or monument, though sometimes not. There's not an obvious example here that I think most people would know, but Clara Barton Parkway in Maryland and Washington, D.C. is one. So if you're familiar with that area.
Yep.
I think it's also worth pointing out here that this is kind of an old designation. In fact, a new national parkway hasn't been established since 1972, and before that, 1950.
Wow.
So I wouldn't be surprised if these kind of have been sort of sunsetted as a designation.
Like. Yeah.
Yeah. There are national historic sites or parks. These are designations for officially recognized areas of national historic significance in the United States. These would oftentimes be sort of some of these old Western forts. In fact, in our neck of the woods, Hunter, Fort Vancouver, up just across the river here, is a national historic site.
Okay.
And Fort Vancouver, listener, if you're unaware, that's sort of where the first population center of the Portland metro region sort of got its founding. It was a British sort of outpost. Eventually becomes the city of Vancouver, Washington. And I believe the original Vancouver, I believe that one was founded before Vancouver, BC.
Initial European American population. Yeah.
Correct. And then finally, there are national scenic trails. These are a series of trails within the United States designated to promote the preservation of, public access to, travel within, and enjoyment and appreciation of the open air, outdoor areas, and historic resources of the nation. The Pacific Coast Trail, for example, is a national scenic trail. The Appalachian Trail, to give an East Coast example, is one. I believe the Continental Divide Trail is also one. So these really long trails that sort of span the country. And that's it. Those are all the designations, but there's a lot of them, right? So you're starting to understand like the National Park Service does quite a lot and has quite a lot of things that it's sort of maintaining and keeping its eye on. And we're going to talk all about sort of the history of how all of this started to come together, how the National Park Service, what was the first national park, right after we get through some ads.
Okay.
So let's do it. We will be right back. And we're back. We are talking about the geography is national parks, geography of national parks, specifically within the United States. So let's go ahead and talk about how these things sort of came to be, sort of the history of national parks. As already mentioned, we are talking primarily about the United States national parks. And this is largely because the concept of national parks as we know them today kind of originated here. Now, as with everything in history, that's a little bit,
It's
obviously
loose.
not the full story.
Yeah.
But if you do like a quick Google search, most things are going to say, yeah, the national park as an idea, as a concept originated here. But let's talk about some reasons why this isn't exactly the case. So there have been other preserved areas in other countries that date back a long time, well before the first national park was established here in sort of the late 1800s of the United States. So, for example, starting sometime around 1735, in the Naples government in Italy undertook laws to protect natural areas, which could be used as a game reserve by the royal family. And so Procida was the first protected site within Italy. Now, the difference here is that, yeah, the government in Italy sort of protected this. It was still owned by the royalty of Napoli. And it wasn't really accessible by common people, at least not in the same way. So that's sort of a differentiator of what's the hook here between sort of a national park in the United States versus sort of one of these old sort of game preserved lands. Obviously, kings have been doing this in Europe for a long time, right?
Sure.
That was a very common.
Mm-hmm.
Now, some naturalists have also argued that there's evidence that indicates that the creation of the first national park in the United States was predated by the creation of the Bogd Khan Mountain National Park in Mongolia, which may date from as early as 1778. I don't know why there's debate. I didn't dig too deeply into it, but it seems like there are some people who are like, well, this is probably actually the very first national park that sort of resembles what we have today. All this is to say, however, that the United States certainly had a large hand in pioneering national parks as a public good, as a public lands, and furthermore, expanding it and growing it and sort of organizing it under a single sort of governmental entity.
Right. So the National Park Service is an institution that kind of tracks back to the United States. This
Right.
kind of organization that might exist in other places now.
Absolutely. So, Hunter, question for you.
Yes.
Do you know what the very first national park was inside the United States?
I think I do. I think it's Yellowstone.
It is. It's absolutely Yellowstone. And what do you know of Yellowstone? What's the first thing you would think of?
I've not been there, so I don't have my geographic imagination isn't wrapped around it as well.
Mhm.
But I'm thinking it's.
If I said the two words Old Faithful, what would you think of?
Oh, right. I'd think of this giant geyser that people stand around and wait to. Okay, that's what's going on. All right.
The giant geyser.
Okay.
Yeah. So Yellowstone was the first national park. However, and it was sort of pushed forward as a national park for the reason that the land was so unlike anything that at least the American sort of settlers and explorers had ever seen before. Obviously, the native tribes around it, was a normal part of their lives,
Right?
For millennia. But that was sort of the idea. It's like this was a very incredibly majestic place. Apparently, though, Yellowstone was not slated to become the first national park. In fact, the first effort by the U.S. federal government to set aside such protected lands was on April 20th, 1832. This had been about 40 years before Yellowstone, when President Andrew Jackson signed legislation to set aside 4 sections of land around what is now Hot Springs, Arkansas, to protect the natural thermal springs and adjoining mountainsides. It was then known as the Hot Springs Reservation, but no legal authority was ever established to manage it, and federal control of the area was not clearly established until 1877.
Okay.
And so Hot Springs is a national park today, and so you can visit it today. However, it kind of, maybe had the crown of like, maybe this was the first one, but there was just never anything that was sort of mustered together to actually designate it, to actually control it, to actually manage it in any capacity.
So it's sort of treated as such, but not official.
Yeah. And I guess like even saying like treated as such, it's a little hard because I mean, they sort of wrote it down in a document, but that didn't. There was no enforcement of anything,
Okay.
right? So there were like it was sort of maybe on name. It was sort of a protected area. There wasn't the national park label was never used either, so it's just kind of this wishy-washy sort of idea. Of course, actually, Hunter, do you know who John Muir is?
I do know who John Muir is.
Who's John Muir?
Naturalist, conservationist from California, I want to say, an advocate of protecting natural environments.
Exactly. So this leads us to sort of what is potentially could have been the next actual first national park. And so John Muir, who is today kind of referred to as the father of national parks due to his work in Yosemite, he pushed a lot of legislation and ideas that specifically would have made Yosemite the very first national park. So apparently Muir published 2 influential articles in the Century magazine, which formed the base for the subsequent legislation on converting Yosemite into a national park. This is sort of in the 1860s. From there, President Abraham Lincoln signed an act of Congress on July 1st, 1864, ceding the Yosemite Valley and the Mariposa Grove of giant sequoias, later becoming Yosemite National Park, to the state of California. According to this bill, private ownership of the land in this area was no longer possible, and the state of California was designated to manage the park for public use, resort, and recreations. So leases were permitted inside the area for up to 10 years, things for like cabins, that kind of stuff, things that we sort of associate with national parks today, but there was no ownership allowed.
Okay.
Public discussion followed this legislation, and there was actually a heated debate on whether the government had the right to create parks, right? So the federal government is ceding this land to California with the idea that, hey, you have to set this land aside and say this is for people to access and recreate in. You can't build there, you can't extract things, but we're going to give it to California and you're going to have to manage it because there's no National Park Service yet, right? There's no federal government to manage this yet.
But they charge California with not allowing people to own any part of it as private property.
Exactly. And so this debate over whether the state of California government has the right to manage this land and say, no, you can't build here. This debate and the overall mismanagement of Yosemite by the California state was the reason why Yosemite did not actually become the first national park.
Okay.
And so there was too much chaos going on at the moment. The federal government, at the time was starting to, there was a lot of proponents at the time starting to push for national parks within the United States. It just kind of became a quagmire, and people were like, "This isn't going to get solved anytime soon. We need to bail on Yosemite as becoming a national park and move on to something else."
I see.
And so that something else would go on and become Yellowstone. So Yellowstone would become the first national park of the United States on March 1st, 1872. And of course, Yellowstone's historic name comes from French trappers who named it Roche Juan. My French is awful. Translating the Hidatsa name Mitsi-a-Datsi, which means Yellowstone River. And it's worth highlighting here that Native American history in the park dates back at least 11,000 years, with Paleo Native Americans using local obsidian tools and weapons, indicating sort of trade with distant tribes, all this kind of stuff, right? This is, going back to what I was saying earlier, tribes have been around this area for a long time.
Right, yeah. At least 11,000 years, yeah.
At least. But it would be John Coulter, sort of going back to the sort of American exploration of the region. It'd be John Coulter of the Lewis and Clark expedition who explored parts of what would become Yellowstone in the 1807, 1808 years, encountering geothermal features and he would later describe them as mystical fire and brimstone area.
That's downright biblical.
Right. So he's painting yeah, right. It's a very, and if you go there, you're like, oh, that kind of fits the landscape a little bit, right? There's a lot of colors. There's a lot of like things shooting out of the ground. Like if you didn't know any better and you didn't have any sort of knowledge of sort of geology or sort of the magnetic sort of underpinnings of our planet, it would definitely feel otherworldly, I think. And so later reports from early explorers like Jim Bridger about Yellowstone's geothermal phenomena were often dismissed as myths. People were like, this can't possibly exist. Right. There's no way.
There's no such thing.
Somebody's making this up. They're pulling one over on us.
That's right.
That there's
I'll tell. Yeah.
Which again, you can kind of understand why that would be the case.
It's like, stop, please.
Yeah.
That's
This so the first organized explorations were hindered until the late 1860s. So this is now well after sort of that Lewis and Clark expedition due to the Civil War. But the Cook Folsom Peterson expedition of 1869, followed by the Washburn Langford Doane expedition of 1870, provided detailed accounts of the region. And these would be the expeditions that would sort of start that process. Okay, let's start figuring out what's going on here. And these people were very much proponents of a national park in the United States. So Cornelius Hedges, who was a member of that Washburn expedition, that second one in 1870, proposed creating a national park to protect this region, an idea supported by others, including at the time Congressman William D. Kelly.
Mm.
And so this would continue on. An 1871 geologic survey supported by government funding was sort of instrumental in persuading Congress to establish Yellowstone as a national park. And this would eventually rope in things like the transcontinental railroad or companies building railroads off that to then sort of establish railway connections, all of that kind of stuff. It would be Nathaniel Langford who was appointed the first superintendent of Yellowstone, but as kind of similar with Hot Springs that we talked about in Arkansas, the original national park, even after it was designated, would suffer from a lack of support and funding, right? There was just not a lot there to protect the park against poaching or vandalism or even early mining efforts, that kind of stuff. There was also considerable opposition to Yellowstone National Park during its early years. So the people of, I believe it was the Montana Territory at the time, this was kind of before Wyoming, I think, became its own territory. So basically the locals who were living there, ranchers, feared that the regional economy would be unable to thrive if there remained strict federal prohibitions against resource development or settlement within park boundaries. And local entrepreneurs advocated for reducing the size of the park so that mining, hunting, and logging activities could be developed. And so, again, this sort of establishes that the national park system, the idea is to conserve these very, very vast areas against these kinds of extractive resources that people want access to. Numerous bills were introduced into Congress by Montana representatives who sought to remove the federal land use restrictions entirely. Of course, those didn't ever work out.
right.
And now we have a very pristine, relatively speaking, Yellowstone National Park. Could have looked very different, however.
It seems like there was, this is a debate that's ongoing in some respects. I imagine that designating a new national park is often controversial because there are going to be some people who would like to benefit from the resources. But anyways, yeah.
Well, what we're going to find is that it's gotten very political. But what we're going to find is there's almost a little bit of the inverse, and we're going to talk about why that is.
Okay.
Right?
Interesting.
There's a lot of politics involved in the establishment of national parks, but it's in that people want one.
I see.
More so than ever.
Okay.
States really want a national park,
Because
as it turns out.
I'm guessing it's tourism dollar related, perhaps.
That would be a large part of it. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
I think I already mentioned this, but Yellowstone would become the first national park of the United States on March 1st, 1872. This would be followed by Sequoia National Park in California on September 25th, 1890. So it's 18 years later. So they sort of founded Yellowstone. Then it took a while for everything to sort of get figured out, right? There's a lot of opposition. It's like, what does this mean? What does a national park mean? This is all sort of new to country and certainly to the people living in these areas who now all of a sudden have to deal with, increased federal restrictions. Yosemite would eventually become a national park. In fact, it's the third oldest at this point, and it was designated on October 1st, 1890, so pretty close to Sequoia. Probably not a surprise. And then Mount Rainier up in Washington State on March 2nd, 1899. And that would be followed pretty quickly by Crater Lake in Oregon on May 22nd, 1902. And then Wind Cave, South Dakota on January 9th, 1903. Do you know when the latest national park was designated, Hunter?
Oh, I don't. I can't. I don't have the answer. I have no answer for that.
I think people think that it's a fairly rare occurrence, but the latest national park to be designated is actually it's New River Gorge in West Virginia.
Okay.
And it was made on December 27th, 2020. So it's not that old.
That's not old at all. Yeah.
Yeah. I would say one comes around every 2 years or so on average would be
Wow.
my
Okay.
guess. And so that mostly brings us up to speed. Obviously, every national park has its own unique story, and we on a single podcast episode we can't cover them all, unfortunately. Uh, so we're gonna leave history behind at this point, but maybe we revisit the subject. Maybe we revisit some key national parks in a later episode, so we can dive into sort of their stories. Because again, the Yosemite National Park, for example, we sort of grazed over sort of why it didn't become a national park, but there's definitely a whole big story there around the efforts of conservation within California specifically.
Mhm.
So maybe we jump back later.
We can do that.
For now, we're going to jump to the current geographic impacts of the national park system.
Good.
But first, we have to hit our last ad break because we're already out of time.
All right. Well, we'll be right back.
And we're back. We're talking about the geography is national parks within the United States specifically. We just ran through some history. We ran through what all the designations were. We ran through what makes a national park at the beginning of this episode. Now let's kind of get to sort of the meat of the episode, which is sort of the national park system today and all of the fun statistics that I was able to pull from a bureau that meticulously calculates everything, which is really handy for us. And I kind of wanted to save all the juicy statistics to the end so that you listener, you pay attention all the way through the episode.
For sticking with us.
Thanks for sticking with us. Hunter, do you know how many national parks exist today?
I could take a guess. I'm
Go for it.
guessing
Take a guess.
maybe 50 or 60, maybe something like that.
That's a really good guess. There are 63
Ooh.
national parks. This would
Okay.
be separate from the national monuments, shorelines, recreation areas, etc. So these are actual national parks. There are 63 of them spread throughout the country. So your guess of 50 to 60, pretty spot on. If I would have guessed what you would guess or what a listener guessed, I would guess that people would say 20, maybe
Okay.
30.
Yeah.
Yeah. Mostly because I think most people think of a few key ones.
Right.
And there's actually a lot that most people don't know exist.
Well, and most of these are in the Western United States.
Oh, we're going to talk a little bit about that
all right.
too.
So
Yeah,
we
we're
can
going
do that
to
geography
get
part.
to the geography of
All right.
where these
Let's
things
not
are.
hold back. Yeah.
The total area protected by national parks is approximately 81,875 square miles of land. Now, using our system of measurement, Connecticut's,
Right. Which doesn't have a national park, by the way.
which doesn't have a national park, this would be about 17 and a half Connecticut's in size.
Wow.
Or to use a single state, it would be a little less than the state of Kansas. So take the state of Kansas, those are all of the national parks combined. That's about the land
Interesting.
that it takes, which is a sizable area.
It is.
Right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's very small compared to the overall size of the United States. Of course, this isn't including things like national forests and all these other things
Right.
managed by other bureaus.
designations.
Right. There's obviously a lot of wildlands still out there. These are just the national parks. If we look at a map of national parks in the United States, there's a pretty interesting trend that you already alluded to, Hunter, that is clearly very visible. The vast majority of national parks are located in the western half of the United States, including Alaska, Hawaii, and American Samoa.
Okay.
Do you want to take a stab at sort of what the spread is here?
Oh, between East and West?
East and West, yeah.
I'm guessing that there may be 10 on the East Coast or something like that.
I mean, that's close, right? So there are only 16 national parks that exist east of the state of Kansas,
Okay.
leaving 47 for everywhere to the west of that.
Okay. Very
30
dissimilar.
states have national parks, as do the territories of American Samoa and the U.S. Virgin Islands. The state with the most national parks is California. They have nine national parks. And this would be followed by Alaska with 8, Utah with 5, and Colorado with 4.
Okay.
Now, again, I think, as people are trying to think of national parks, I don't think most people would even know all of the ones in California. In fact, would you know them offhand?
I could not rattle off all 9. I don't think I could do that.
I don't know if I could. I wish I actually pulled this information. Actually, I have the Wikipedia page here. I'll list them off here. So there's Joshua Tree,
Amazing.
which is an amazing area. There's the Channel Islands, which
Okay.
I don't think most people would guess that's a national park. That's sort of string of islands off the coast of California,
Mhm.
obviously. There's Sequoia, beautiful area. There's a place called the Pinnacles National Park, which I've never been to, and this is one that's I'm definitely very unfamiliar with as somebody who's from California.
Yeah, I've lived in California, but I've never been to Pinnacles.
There's Kings Canyon, again, not super familiar with it.
Right.
There's Yosemite, obviously, this is the big one.
Mm-hmm.
There's Lassen Volcanic, which I have heard about. I've not been. It's where Lassen Peak is.
I've been to Lassen, and it's
really?
It's spectacular. Yeah.
I think, is it Lassen Peak that's also the highest peak in California? Maybe. I wonder. I don't know. That's a total.
We'll have
aside.
to get back to that. Yeah.
Yeah. There's Redwood, which I think most people would know of. The Redwood National Park, obviously very beautiful. There's Death Valley, the hottest place in the planet. Maybe, I think so. Yes. Well, temperatures have exceeded 130 degrees.
That's hot.
Or 54 degrees Celsius.
I'm hoping it doesn't get too much hotter anywhere else.
Yeah. There and that's it. Those are the 9. So there's just a lot there, right? There's a lot of different things there. Yeah, and I won't list off the other states as well, but the largest national park in the country is Wrangell St. Elias in Alaska, and that's over 12,500 square miles, or about 2.5 Connecticuts in size.
That's a big national park. Yeah,
it's a big national park, right? Like, I mean, Connecticut's not a huge state, but it's not like it's still sizable, right?
Yeah,
to have that all as
it's not Rhode Island. Come on now. Yeah, no offense to our listeners in Rhode Island.
In fact, the Wrangell St. Elias National Park is larger than each of the 9 smallest states of the United States.
Wow.
So, do you want to take a guess? I think you probably already know this, but do you want to take a guess at what the smallest national park is?
Because we mentioned the Statue of Liberty, I'm going to go with that.
Well, the Statue of Liberty is a national monument.
National monument.
National park.
Oh, so national park. Yeah. The smallest national park. Yeah, I don't know. I'm afraid to guess because I think I'd be way off.
Well, I'll just go ahead and tell you it's a little bit of a head scratcher. Most people probably wouldn't have guessed it, but we did mention it already on this episode, and it is the Gateway Arch in St. Louis. And we're going to talk all about sort of why that's a national park here in a minute.
Yeah, I have been to the Gateway Arch, and it's pretty dramatic because you can go up in it, and it's a little vertigo inducing, but there's quite a view. And yeah, they call it the Gateway to the West, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah.
Yep, that's a common moniker for St. Louis as a whole, right?
Yep.
Now, these parks are all incredibly popular. Not all of them, but the national park system is very, very popular, both domestically and abroad. In 2021, the national parks set a visitor record with more than 92 million people, highlighting that I think that these places are pretty important to people and very important to the economies of the states that they exist in, because a lot of people sort of establish, national park as sort of almost like a trophy. It's like a bragging right for your state to have one a little bit. And so, Hunter, again, another question for you. Do you want to take a guess at what the most visited national park is?
Yeah,
I don't have this in my notes.
I've got an idea on this one. I'm going to say the Grand Canyon National Park.
And you would be wrong by a lot, actually.
Wow.
So,
do I get a second guess?
Grand Canyon. Do you want to take a second guess? Yeah.
I could be wrong again. Yosemite.
Still wrong.
Dang. All right. Well, then we got 61 to go here.
I would be surprised if you guessed this because it was a total surprise to me.
Okay.
The reality is that it's the most visited by like a lot. It is the Great Smoky Mountains in North Carolina and Tennessee.
Wow. Yeah, that would not have been in my top 10 probably.
Yeah. What? Right. I think for most people, unless you're there, apparently in 2022, the Great Smoky Mountains had 12,937,000 visitors just within 2022.
Wow.
The number 2, the second most, would be Grand Canyon at 4.7 million.
I feel a little
it's about
better
3
now.
times. Yeah, exactly. Then there would be so I guess all that's to say is I think most people would probably be like you, Hunter. They would guess the Grand Canyon, Yosemite, or Yellowstone. These are very iconic national parks.
Yep. Perhaps the best well-known.
But those, right. But the Grand Canyon would come in at number 2. We already talked about that. Yosemite comes in at number 6 with 3.6 million people, and Yellowstone at 7th with 3.3 million people. So it's quite the drop off. The number 3 is actually pretty interesting. Actually, sorry, number 3 is Zion. That's probably not a surprise, followed by Rocky Mountains. The number 5, just above Yosemite, I thought was pretty interesting, and that's Acadia in Maine.
Okay.
The Acadia National Park, with almost 4 million people visiting that.
Well, it sort of stands to reason that, I mean, there's a lot more population on the East Coast than there is on the West Coast. So that adds up a little bit if you think about it that way.
Yeah, I think once you start thinking about it, you start thinking about the geographies that sort of surround these places. Getting to a place like Zion, for example, it's beautiful, or even Yellowstone, or even Yosemite, right? These are beautiful places, but getting to them is hard. Even if let's say you live in Phoenix, for example, and you want to take a visit up to the Grand Canyon, that's a trek, right?
Yeah.
You're not taking a flight there. Now, it's a trek to get to the Great Smoky Mountains as well, right? It's not like it's next to Nashville or Charlotte, North Carolina. However, the distances are a little bit smaller, and there's just more population overall.
Right.
If you look at a sort of population density map, of the East versus the West, you're going to notice a pretty stark difference in how many people there actually are over on that side.
Yeah,
of the country.
There's a few major cities not super far away compared to these other examples that we've been talking about.
Right. So I have another question for you.
Okay.
It's perhaps a bit unfair for you to take a guess here, but here we are.
Okay.
Do you know what the least visited national park is?
Oh,
I mean, I would be so surprised if you had a guess.
So you think that I probably wouldn't know this, in other words?
I think you would probably not know this, but maybe. I think you could probably hazard a guess at sort of the geographic location.
Okay.
I don't know if you would guess the exact one.
Because you mentioned that there is a national park in America, Samoa, I'm going to guess that one.
That would be a fantastic guess. The American Samoa National Park, as it's called, is the second least visited, with only 12,000 people visiting it in 2022. The least visited would be the Gates of the Arctic in Alaska. So it's the country's northernmost park.
Okay.
It only got about 9,400 people to visit it in 2022. So, listener, if you want some national park trophies to add to your collection here, and you want to, some bragging rights a little bit, you can go and visit some of these places.
You'll get from the people who try to visit them all if you go there. Yeah.
Right. I mean, Alaska has 3 of the top 5 or lowest 5 visited, right? Which is probably not a surprise because Alaska is a huge state, and there's not a whole lot of infrastructure, so getting to these places is a monumental challenge. Obviously, American Samoa, that's also a pretty hard trip to get out there.
Right.
The most interesting one, I think, is number 5, which is Isle Royale in Michigan. And so only about 25,000 people have visited it.
Okay.
It's the largest island in Lake Superior. And it's very isolated relatively, but Michigan is populous. There's a lot of people up there. I don't know. The other one that I thought
is Isle Royale only accessible by boat? There's no land.
Probably.
There's probably no landing strip or anything.
There's probably no land bridge. I don't have a map in front of me of it, unfortunately.
Or like a landing strip for a plane or something like that. Maybe.
Well, there are planes that do go there. I know that, but I think they land.
You can land in the
water.
So yeah. Right.
Right. Mm-hmm.
You can go back to our air travel episode if you want to learn more about that kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. I would say the most surprising, and so this comes in at number 6, the most surprising least visited national park is the North Cascades National Park in Washington State. Only about 30,000 people visited it in 2022. The reason why this is so surprising is because it's actually fairly close to Seattle metropolitan area, right? It's, it's not that far away. You could do it in a day trip. You can go up there and visit it. And if you compare it to Mount Rainier or the Olympic, it's, I think, let me see if I can find those on my list here. But those ones get, Olympic National Park gets 2.5 million people. It's about the same distance away.
Yep.
Mount Rainier gets 1.6 million, right? And so I think that always surprised me. I'm like, oh, what's going on up there? Why is this not getting as much?
I mean, I would speculate that you can see Mount Rainier from Seattle sometimes, right? Isn't that true?
That's true.
Right. So it's
absolutely.
looming, right? And so that's on people's radar. And then Olympic National Park is close to the coast as well. And so I wonder if that's part of the draw as well, perhaps.
Right.
Yeah.
And because we're here in Oregon, I gotta talk about our local National Park a little bit. So Crater Lake, if you haven't visited, listener, it is truly beautiful. It's a big crater that's a lake. It's actually a collapsed volcano. It wasn't caused by a meteor. It's a whole other thing.
It's a caldera. Yes.
Caldera, yep. Crater Lake in 2022 had 527,000 visitors in just last year or 2 years ago, and it placed 37th. So it is one of the less visited national parks. So
there aren't a lot of
if you want a little
big cities nearby Crater Lake.
No, it's kind of, I would say it's almost getting pretty close to being equidistant between Sacramento and Portland.
That sounds about right.
Which is a hard drive. It's probably about 4 hours if we were to drive south from Portland. Probably about 4 or 5 hours if you drive north from.
Is it only 4 or 5 hours from Portland?
I think so.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know exactly. It's been a while since I've been to drive.
Right.
Okay. It could be a little bit further. Yeah.
Not sure.
Anyways, it's far. It's secluded for sure. Beautiful though.
It's the bluest water that I remember seeing, I think, perhaps. I mean,
right.
Yeah.
So to conclude our episode on national parks, Hunter, I kind of want to talk a little bit about the Gateway Arch because it's definitely different from all the other national parks we've been talking about, right? So it's actually, I have this like fun corollary, which is like you're taking one of those standardized tests, and it's like one of these is not like the others, and you have to pick one of the 4 questions. This would be one of those, right? You look at 4 national parks and the Gateway Arch is there. It's like one of these is not like the others.
Sesame Street had a whole song about that, I think. Yeah.
And so the Gateway Arch is 92 acres in total area size, which would make the Gateway National Arch National Park the smallest national park by far. The next smallest would be Hot Springs, Arkansas, that we talked about earlier in this episode, which is about 5,500 acres.
Okay.
Right. So this is a fraction, and that's 5,500 acres is still really small, compared
to
a
national park.
So the Gateway Arch itself was built in 1965 and was originally designated as the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial. However, on June 26th, 2017, so not that long ago, Senator Roy Blunt, who was a Republican, introduced Gateway Arch National Park National Park Designation Act to redesignate the Jefferson National Expansion Memorial as the Gateway Arch National Park. And the reason why I brought up Republican is because the legislation was co-sponsored by Senator Claire McCaskill, who was a Democrat, both from the state of Missouri.
Okay.
So just illustrating that this was a bipartisan effort. Yeah. This was largely seen as a way to push more tourism to St. Louis due to the overwhelming popularity of national parks, right? So national parks, again, it's a very popular concept. Americans generally really love national parks, and to have one for a state is it's kind of seen as bragging rights. States that don't have them, they I think they feel a little left out sometimes.
I think that's true. I think that's definitely true. Let me make sure I understand this. It was a national park before, and then they renamed it, or it was designated a national park in 2007?
It wasn't part of the National Park Service at all before. It was designated under the Department of the Interior as Jefferson National Expansion Memorial, which is a whole other thing.
Okay, right.
Right. It wasn't a national monument. It wasn't anything. It was not part of the National Park
So
Service.
when I visited it was not a national park. I'm realizing now. Yeah.
Right. It would have just been, just its own sort of memorial.
Okay.
And we have to remember that, these two senators wanted this because for the tourism, and because remember, like National Park Service has really good branding. To be associated and have a tie to the National Park Service is sought after.
Well, there are a lot of people who want to just go to as many as possible, or maybe all of them. And so if you become one, then you get at least that population plus people who are wanting to visit it for other reasons.
Right. There's definitely a gotta catch them all sort of sense here. Yep. So initially the National Park Service pushed back on this designation, suggesting that instead it should be redesignated as a national monument, which would align it with things such as the Statue of Liberty, which I think is probably a fair and sensical sort of designation, right?
Yeah.
If we compare the Gateway Arch to, Yosemite and the Statue of Liberty, I think most people would say, oh, it's probably more like the Statue of Liberty.
It's more urban than most of the other any of the other examples I think that we've been talking about.
Exactly. And that's one of the things, right? It's an urban area. So despite this pushback by the National Park Service, Congress officially passed the act and the Gateway Arch became an official national park. And this has been highly critiqued by nature journalists throughout the country, as it doesn't really conserve, quote unquote, a natural area,
Hmm.
which is, again, that's very true, right? This is an urban area. There's nothing really natural about it at this point. There's a lot of grass, there's some buildings, there's obviously the Gateway Arch, which is entirely man-made,
Right.
right? It's
Giant stadium nearby. Yeah.
a giant stadium nearby. It's worth noting that as of 2023, so there's some more recent statistics, the Gateway Arch had about 2.4 million visitors. And this is the highest it's been since 2012 when it hit 2.5 million visitors.
Okay.
Though it's still considerably down from 1966 after it opened, which when it got 4.4 million visitors. But this perhaps illustrates that, there actually is a benefit to having a national park designation, right? Because if you go back to, was it like 2015, 2016, it was sort of floating around the 1.4, 1.5 million visitor range. And now it's sort of peaking up again.
That's like got a million more visitors at least, right? Yearly because of that.
Which is right. I mean, that's
Not
probably a
quite
huge
double,
boom
but a
for St.
lot.
Louis.
Yeah, absolutely.
I've driven through St. Louis. I did not stop to take a visit to the I was pretty young. I was probably 20. It wasn't really on my radar. Saw it from the freeway. I was like, oh, that's kind of neat, and just kept going.
Yep.
And I was like, yeah.
I was in my 20s when I went there. When I went up it, and then my sister lives in the area. So
Okay.
But last time we went there as a family, they were doing construction on it, or some repairs or beautification, something. I'm not sure. Yeah. Next time.
So anyway, I guess all that's to say, I wanted to talk about the Gateway Arch because it sort of illustrates the, politicking of, if we go back to sort of the first part of this episode, we ran through some of the criteria of what makes a national park. And,
right.
Obviously the criteria is that Congress has to sign off on it, and that's it. That's all it is. Once Congress does that, then all of that other stuff, those shoulds that we talked about, sort of fall by the wayside.
Congress may or may not take that criteria into account when they're making this designation. There seems to be evidence for that recently. Yes,
absolutely. Yep. And so to close us out here, Hunter, I thought it might be fun to talk about some of the ideas that are floating around about the next potential national park because. Like I said, one comes around every few years. It's not like a super uncommon occurrence. One hasn't been designated since 2020. So there's probably one due.
Right.
And so according to one National Geographic article from June 3rd, 2023, these are the current contenders.
Okay.
And I'm not super familiar with some of these, but we'll run through them. So there's and I'm probably going to mispronounce this, but the Ocmulgee Mounds Ocmulgee Mounds National Historic Park in Georgia.
Okay.
Georgia doesn't currently have a national park, so this might be their first. There's the Craters of the Moon National Monument and Preserve in Idaho, which I am familiar with, and it is quite stark and beautiful if you've ever seen it. There's Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument in Maine.
Katahdin.
Yeah. Katahdin. Yeah. So I appreciate the pronunciation now. It's the New England names always get me. It's is it Worcester or is it Worcester?
Worcester.
I think it's Worcester.
It's Worcester. Yeah.
There's the Chiricahua National Monument in Arizona, the Shawnee National Forest in Illinois, the Delaware Water Gap National Recreation Area in New Jersey and Pennsylvania, and then the Tongass National Forest in Alaska. So these are sort of the ones that are floated out. I've also seen Mount Hood floated, Mount Hood National Forest for Oregon floated as a potential national park. I'm not sure how many legs that one has. In fact, I'm not sure if any of these necessarily have legs or if this is just National Geographic sort of saying this is sort of what we think as
this would be good.
Most likely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because it's not really like the process isn't really made. It's all political, right? It's, what's going to be sort of floated in front of Congress.
Right.
And that sort of also necessitates having sort of a Congress that's, functioning at any given moment, which is not always the case. Right. So, when and where, it's all determined by politics, but I thought it was fun. I think it's always fun to sort of speculate on, what the next one's going to be. Do you have an idea of what you would want to see as the next one?
What would I want to see?
Do you have any place?
I mean, I'm familiar with Mount Katahdin a little bit in that area. So that hits my heartstrings a little bit because I'm familiar with the area.
You deserve one?
I on the one hand, I think Connecticut deserves one. I'm not sure where it should be necessarily, but there's got to be. I mean, there's a lot of beautiful spots. I grew up but very near a state park. So it
Mhm.
probably wouldn't be a good candidate for a national park, but it was great having it nearby and going on lots of hikes with my family, and we could access it from our house. So that was cool.
Yeah. I always thought that bringing it back to Oregon, that the Columbia River Gorge
Mm,
it's very dramatic
yeah.
landscape. Very cool. I don't know I mean, there's a lot of development there
Hmm.
at this point, so I'm not sure how you would necessarily cordon off areas for a national park, but that's always a place where I'm like, this is an area that is, I think, follows along with the spirit of a national
Right.
park. If we look back at things like, the Grand Canyon or Yosemite or Yellowstone, where it's so awe-inspiring and majestic. You're like, wow, how am I going through this right now?
Right.
How is this, that I feel like, there's always a part of me that's like, well, maybe that should be a national park, but I don't know how you fit it in there at this
Yeah.
point.
And it's a waterway with an enormous amount of economic activity still. So I don't know how that
Exactly. And that's
factors
probably
in.
why.
Yeah, that might be it. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, this has been a really fun episode. Hunter, who are you? Tell our listeners where they can find you.
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm co-author of Portland as a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas, San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle. I've co-authored those with David Banis. And I am co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything, with you, Jeff.
Thanks, Hunter. Yeah, my name's Jeff Gibson. You can find me over on YouTube. In addition to this podcast, just Google my name on whatever YouTube. You'll find me. If you liked what you heard today, please rate, review on Apple Podcasts, all these fun stuff, Spotify. Or if you're listening to this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. It really helps us out over there. You get all these, now there's video versions of this. You can sort of see some of these places we're talking about, see maps of these places. If you want to find more of our stuff, you can always go over to Substack, geographyseverything.substack, where you can get this all sent directly to your email box. It's totally free. We don't charge anything. Do that. It's just an easy way to sort of get this directly sent to you. Next week, Hunter, I think we are doing a pretty interesting episode.
That's right. Yes.
Which is all about whales.
All about whales. So now for something completely different. Yeah. And as I'm preparing it, I'm realizing this is just yet another topic that I'm wondering how we're going to fit within an hour. But that's the challenge. And I think it's going to be very interesting. I've been kind of fascinated with whales. I grew up in a place where there was a lot of whaling, which is sort of economic activity that's discouraged now by international law. But yeah, we'll get into whales next week.
Yeah, it should be fun. I think, the way I'm thinking about it is like so much of what we talk about is so wholly focused on land. Mm-hmm. Obviously, that's where humans are. It's where a lot of the things that we build are, a lot of like the nature, the national parks, for example, are. I think this will be really interesting because it's going to be, it's almost like a very different viewpoint of our planet, right? The whales can go in a lot of different places and they travel around in a lot of different ways.
That's right.
Because they're in an ocean, they're in a body of water that's all connected.
That's right. So it's time to get aquatic here. Yes.
We're going to get aquatic. So come back next week. We're going to do the Geography as Whales episode. Should be a lot of fun. And I guess that will do it for us today. So we will see you then.
Thank you for listening.